The precise world, a grid of lines and labels, was my sanctuary. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of calipers and the whisper of tracing paper, moved with an almost surgical grace across the vellum spread before me. I, Reid, a historical cartographer by trade and by temperament, found solace in the absolute certainty of boundaries, the immutable truth of a mapped landscape. My current project, a meticulous reconstruction of a 17th-century trade route through the Carpathians, demanded unwavering focus, each stroke of the pen a testament to hours of archival excavation. The air in my studio, usually thick with the scent of old paper and ink, was a comforting companion. Then, a letter arrived, an unwelcome disruption to my ordered existence. The solicitor's crest, embossed in heavy silver, promised nothing good. My great-aunt, a distant and spectral presence even in life, had finally, mercifully, departed. And in her wake, she bequeathed to me the ancestral estate, a sprawling, decrepit manor I had only ever heard spoken of in hushed, slightly fearful tones. It was located deep within the forgotten folds of the countryside, a place where the roads narrowed to little more than overgrown tracks and the silence pressed in, heavy and unbroken. Reluctantly, I packed my precise instruments, my mind already mapping the logistical challenges of such a move. The journey was long, the landscape growing progressively wilder, the town sparser, until the very air seemed to thicken with isolation. When the estate finally materialized through a shroud of ancient oaks, it was less a home and more a monument to decay. Stone wept lichen, slate roofs sagged like tired shoulders, and windows, many shattered, gazed out like vacant eyes. Every step I took on the creaking floorboards felt like an intrusion. Rooms lay draped in ghostly sheets, or stood exposed, their contents frozen in time, a half-finished embroidery, a stack of yellowed books, a forgotten chessboard. It was a mausoleum of memory, each object a shard of a past I barely knew, yet now, inexplicably, owned. Days blurred into a methodical exploration, a grim cataloging of inherited disarray. I opened sarcophagus-like chests, unearthed forgotten wardrobes, and sifted through mountains of ephemera. It was during this painstaking process, tucked away in the forgotten corner of a vast, unheated library, that I found it. Within, beneath layers of moth-eaten tapestries and brittle lace, lay a scroll. The scent it exhaled was not merely of age, but something deeper, earthier, like ancient soil disturbed. It was a map, unmistakably, of the estate and its surrounding lands. Ink, a deep, faded sepia, spoke of centuries. My cartographer's eye immediately recognized the astounding precision of its draftsmanship. Every contour, every ancient oak, every winding stream was rendered with a devotion that mirrored my own. The hand that drew this was a master, no doubt. Yet, as my gaze lingered, a creeping unease began to curdle the professional admiration. These were not simply unfinished sections, they were deliberate omissions, bordered by an unnerving clarity. And then the symbols. Not standard cartographic marks, but intricate, looping glyphs, like a forgotten script, clustered around the blank spaces or hovering over features I couldn't identify. They seemed to pulse with an unspoken meaning, a secret language etched onto the very land. My fingers traced one, a spiral within a triangle, and a faint vibration seemed to hum beneath the parchment, a resonance I felt deep in my bones. Pushing it open, I expected another antechamber choked with forgotten furniture. Instead, a peculiar sight greeted me. It was a school hallway during summer with wrong decorations. Faded construction paper cutouts of autumn leaves clung desperately to walls painted a cheerful, yet peeling, yellow. A forgotten blackboard leaned against one side, scrawled with an equation that made no sense, a string of symbols utterly alien. I returned to the map, the image of that jarring hallway echoing in my mind. The blank spaces, the cryptic symbols, the sheer, unsettling detail where it did exist. It wasn't just an incomplete document. It was a riddle, a challenge to my very profession. My hands, which had always sought certainty, now found themselves drawn to the ambiguity, to the tantalizing possibility of a hidden truth. The meticulous cartographer in me saw a project, a puzzle demanding to be solved. The estate, a sprawling canvas of neglect and ancient earth, lay before me. My inheritance, a weight of history far heavier than any deed or ledger, called me into its tangled embrace. I, Reid, stepped out from the main house, the morning air a cool, damp caress against my skin, smelling of loam and decay. In my hand, the inherited map, its vellum skin a testament to forgotten hands and faded ink, felt both like a guide and a burden. Its lines, so precise, promised an order that the visible world stubbornly refused to offer. My cartographer's instincts, honed over decades of deciphering the past, urged me forward. The initial survey of the grounds, a quick walkthrough upon my arrival, had been cursory. Now, armed with the old map and a modern GPS unit, I intended a true reconciliation. I began at the estate's southern boundary, where the map depicted a narrow, winding path leading to what was simply labeled the dell. Modern records, however, showed nothing but an unbroken expanse of woodland. Pushing through a thicket of gnarled rhododendrons, their glossy leaves slick with dew, I found myself on what felt like a path, though it was barely discernible beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. The air here was cooler, a pocket of chill that no breeze could explain. It was not the crisp cold of a winter morning, but a damp, penetrating coolness that seemed to emanate from the very earth. My breath plumed faintly, an unexpected ghost in the early summer air. The path, such as it was, led me deeper. The light began to dim, swallowed by the dense canopy overhead, even though the sun was still climbing. They felt ancient, heavy, as though they had never truly retreated, even in the brightest noon. The map showed a small, ornamental bridge here, crossing a seasonal stream. I found only a choked gully, its banks collapsed, the stream a dry, stony scar. The bridge was gone, or perhaps had never existed outside the cartographer's dream. Further on, the map indicated a small, secluded folly nestled in a clearing. Instead, I stumbled upon a structure that brought me to an abrupt halt. It was not a folly. It was a building, long and low, its windows shattered, its clapboard siding peeling like sunburnt skin. A narrow, concrete path, cracked and overrun with weeds, led to a double door, one half hanging askew on a single rusted hinge. This building was entirely absent from any contemporary documentation. My GPS confirmed my location, pinpointing me precisely where the map showed the dell. But this was no dell. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The air was stagnant, tasting of dust and the faint, sweet decay of damp wood. And then I saw it, a long, empty corridor stretching before me, lined with doors. Faded construction paper cutouts of autumn leaves, brittle and curling, clung to the walls, incongruous against the summer light filtering weakly through the broken windows. A tattered banner, proclaiming Harvest Festival, drooped above what might have been a classroom door. A small, child-sized desk, overturned, lay in the middle of the hallway, a faint chalk dust outlining where it had fallen. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft, rhythmic drip of water somewhere deeper within the structure. My mind, accustomed to the logic of lines and boundaries, rebelled. A school? Here? In this forgotten corner of the estate? The map showed nothing of the sort. I moved slowly, my boots scuffing on the gritty floor, each step echoing with an unsettling clarity. The wrong decorations, the out-of-season festivity, the quiet abandonment, imbued the space with a spectral quality. It felt as though life had simply ceased here, mid-celebration, leaving these faded remnants as silent witnesses. As I reached the end of the hallway, a low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from behind one of the closed doors. I paused, straining my ears, but it did not repeat. My rational mind dismissed it as the building settling, or a trick of the wind, yet the hair on my arms prickled. Back outside, disoriented, I consulted the map again. Its elegant script offered no explanation for the abandoned school. I continued my exploration, following a dotted line that suggested an old game trail. Here, the discrepancies grew more pronounced. I found a series of rough-hewn stone markers, half buried in the earth, forming an irregular circle. They were not boundary stones, nor did they appear to mark graves. Each was weathered, its surface pitted and worn, bearing no discernible carvings or symbols, yet their placement felt deliberate, purposeful. The further I ventured, the more the estate seemed to shift under my gaze, refusing to conform to the precise geometry of my inherited document. The ground itself seemed to breathe, emitting faint, earthy murmurs that were too low to be wind, too regular to be animal. The estate was not merely overgrown, it was actively concealing, actively resisting, holding secrets that neither map nor deed could fully account for. And I, Reid, felt an unnerving certainty that these secrets were stirring something else. A scent of damp stone, perhaps, but with an undercurrent of something ancient, forgotten, like the breath of a tomb disturbed. It was a smell that clung to the very air, a silent declaration of the land's deep, patient memory. My gaze swept across the overgrown gardens, the skeletal remains of rose bushes clawing at the mist-shrouded morning. A flicker. Just at the edge of my vision, near the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, a brief, indistinct movement. A bird, perhaps, darting into the foliage. I blinked, fixating on the spot, but saw nothing but the still, gray branches. My mind, ever the cartographer, sought explanation, dismissed the anomaly as a product of weary eyes and unfamiliar surroundings. Yet, a subtle chill, not of the morning air, traced its way down my spine. Later, within the echoing silence of the main hall, I found a small, polished wooden box, a relic from some distant relative, open on the console table, its lid slightly ajar. I distinctly recalled closing it the previous night, securing its contents, a handful of tarnished silver buttons. A slight tremor ran through me. Had I forgotten? My memory, usually a precise instrument, offered no clear affirmation or denial. I closed the lid with a snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house, then moved on, attributing the oversight to the stress of relocation, the vastness of the estate, the sheer volume of forgotten things. As dusk bled into night, painting the high windows with hues of bruised plum and charcoal, I sat in the study, the map spread before me, its parchment breathing a faint, earthy scent. It was not wind. The house was stout, its windows sealed. My skin prickled. This was harder to dismiss. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, was not a balm but a descent into disquiet. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust and stale floor wax. But this was no ordinary school. From the lockers, instead of cheerful student art, hung garlands of dried, withered autumn leaves, their brittle forms crumbling to the floor. And taped to the pale green walls, between faded posters of forgotten academic achievements, were children's drawings. Not the vibrant, innocent scribbles one expects, but crude, urgent sketches in charcoal and blood-red crayon, figures with too many limbs, faces twisted into silent screams, eyes like black, bottomless wells. A sense of profound wrongness permeated the space. I walked, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, searching for an exit, a door that wasn't locked, a window that wasn't barred. I jolted awake, a strangled gasp catching in my throat, the metallic tang of fear coating my tongue. I threw off the sweat-soaked sheets, the cool morning air a sudden shock against my skin. The sun, a pale disk behind heavy cloud, offered little comfort. My logical mind, a fortress I had always trusted, felt breached, its walls crumbling under the relentless assault of these inexplicable occurrences. Driven by an urgent, unsettling premonition, I rose and made my way to the study. The map lay where I had left it, an expanse of aged parchment under the dim morning light. I leaned over it, my breath catching. A faint, almost imperceptible line had appeared. It wasn't a topographical contour I recognized, nor a boundary marker. A point that, before, had been blank. Now, a minuscule symbol, like a stylized, ancient eye, had manifested there, barely visible without intense scrutiny. It wasn't ink, it was as if the parchment itself had absorbed a new truth, bleeding it onto its surface. My hand trembled as I traced the new line, the texture of the old paper feeling rough, almost alive beneath my fingertips. The meticulous cartographer in me screamed for a rational explanation, a trick of the light, a latent stain reacting to humidity, a flaw I had simply overlooked. But the symbol, the eye, was too deliberate, too alien to have been a natural imperfection. It was as though the map, this inert object of paper and ink, was awakening, revealing secrets it had held for centuries, secrets now demanding to be seen. The estate was not merely decaying, it was changing. And I, Reid, was at the heart of its transformation, an unwilling participant in a ritual I was only beginning to comprehend. The morning air, heavy with the scent of loam and something ancient, had beckoned me to the estate's sprawling grounds, but the true call lay within. The map, with its unsettling lacunae and cryptic symbols, pulled me back inside, towards the dust-choked silence of the library. Here, in the heart of the main house, amidst towering shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten lives, I sought answers. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to the precise lines of topography, now grappled with the tangled contours of history. The air in the library was thick with the aroma of decaying paper and the faint, metallic tang of time itself. Sunlight, fractured by grimy panes, striped the motes dancing in the stillness. I began my excavation not with a shovel, but with gloved hands, sifting through ledgers bound in brittle leather, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbons, and journals whose covers felt soft with the passage of generations. My fingers, usually tracing the elegant curves of rivers and boundaries, now brushed against the spidery script of my predecessors. At first, the entries were mundane: crop yields, repairs to outbuildings, the hiring of estate workers. But gradually, a discordant note began to weave through the tapestry of daily life. An ancestor, a woman named Ilara, wrote of the land's deep hum, a sound felt more in the bone than the ear. Later, her script grew erratic, detailing shadows that drank the light and voices whispering from the earth's throat. She spoke of a hunger, a persistent, gnawing presence beneath the soil, demanding its due. My gaze drifted to the map, to a particular unmarked grove I had only just begun to survey. I found references to specific locations on my incomplete map, places I had marked as unidentified feature or anomalous depression. A diary from a distant cousin. The pattern, once a faint suggestion, began to sharpen into a horrifying clarity. Generations of my family, particularly those who inherited the estate, seemed to succumb to a similar trajectory, an initial fascination with the land, followed by a growing unease, then an escalating madness culminating in either disappearance or a profound, self-destructive despair. Cryptic letters exchanged between family members spoke of the pact, the ancient agreement, and the sacrifices required to keep the earth quiet. Quiet. One particularly disturbing journal, its pages brittle as autumn leaves, contained not just text but crude, unsettling drawings. Some of these figures held small, round objects, which I slowly realized were meant to be heads. Tucked within its final, almost illegible entry, a faded photograph fluttered to the floor. I picked it up. It showed a long, narrow corridor, dimly lit, with peeling paint on the walls. Faded, tattered paper chains, meant for some forgotten celebration, hung limply from the ceiling. On the walls, children's drawings, once vibrant, now bled into the discolored plaster. But these weren't cheerful scribbles. They depicted grotesque, wide-mouthed figures with too many eyes, looming over smaller, cowering shapes. One drawing, particularly vivid in its decay, showed a figure with tendrils reaching out, seeming to pull a child into a swirling vortex of black ink. A welcome back banner, ironically cheerful and utterly out of place, hung askew, half-fallen, revealing the crumbling wall beneath. My breath hitched. The image was a visceral shock, an impossible intrusion into the historical narrative I was meticulously piecing together. Why would such a place exist on this estate? What connection did it bear to the vanishing children, the madness, the sacrifices? My cartographer's instinct for spatial reasoning screamed, demanding to know its location, its purpose. The map, spread out on the polished mahogany table, no longer seemed a neutral guide. Its lines and symbols, once mere geographical markers, now pulsed with a sinister significance. The marked features were not landmarks, they were altars, or perhaps, graves. The map was not just a guide to the land, it was a key, a blueprint to something malevolent, something ancient and hungry, inextricably linked to the very blood that coursed through my veins. And I, Reid, had just begun to turn its lock. Here, in the heart of the estate, the air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken weight, a density that pressed against my skin. I traced the jagged edges of the incomplete drawing, my fingers ghosting over lines that ended abruptly, over blank spaces where something vital should have been. I dismissed it as the house settling, a familiar lament of old structures, but a cold prickle began to crawl up my spine. The light outside began to wane, bleeding into the room in bruised purples and bruised oranges. They seemed to coil around the very air molecules, a serpentine hiss that brushed against my eardrums. I strained, leaning closer to the map, convinced the sound emanated from the parchment itself. Mine. The word was a dry rasp, like stones grinding together, clear as a bell, yet utterly impossible. It is mine. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the study's far wall, startling me. A framed landscape painting, one I had admired for its serene depiction of a distant coastline, had fallen from its hook, shattering its glass upon the polished floorboards. Shards glittered, catching the dying light like scattered teeth. I stood rigid, my breath catching in my throat, the fear a bitter taste on my tongue. This was no settling house. This was something deliberate. Then, the world warped. Fluorescent lights, flickering erratically overhead, cast a sickly, jaundiced glow on lockers adorned with tinsel and garish plastic baubles. A faded banner proclaiming Happy Halloween hung crookedly above a door draped in Christmas lights. The air, usually thick with the memory of linoleum and cleaning solution, was instead heavy with the cloying sweetness of wilting lilies, a scent utterly out of place. Empty classrooms stretched out on either side, their doors ajar, revealing desks stacked haphazardly, blackboards scrawled with nonsensical equations, and, in one room, a single, deflated birthday balloon bobbing mournfully against the ceiling. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of the faulty lights and a distant, rhythmic dripping sound. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind scrabbled for purchase, for the solid reality of the library, the comforting weight of the map. He comes. The voice, now a distinct, guttural rumble, vibrated not in my ears, but in the very marrow of my bones. Your blood remembers. I gasped, the strange vision dissolving around me as quickly as it had appeared. I was back in the library, my hands gripping the edge of the oak table so tightly my knuckles were white. The shattered glass of the painting still lay scattered, a tangible testament to the violence. The scent of lilies, however, lingered, a faint, sickly sweet perfume that made my stomach churn. The land demands. The lineage owes. I needed to call someone, anyone. My fingers fumbled for the ancient rotary phone on the desk, its brass glinting dully. I tried to dial the number of a local colleague, a historian I occasionally consulted on arcane land records. It was not a mechanical sound. It was organic, alive, filled with a primal hunger. I dropped the phone as if it were a venomous snake, the receiver clattering against the wood. The pages of the map on the table fluttered violently, as if a spectral hand had brushed across them. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. I spun, my eyes darting frantically around the room. It was gone before I could focus, leaving only the impression of something impossibly tall, impossibly lean. My heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stumbled backward, knocking against a heavy armchair. Give. Give what is due. The price must be paid. They pressed in, assaulting my mind, each syllable a shard of ice, each phrase a hook digging into my sanity. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I slammed the receiver down, my hand shaking. The phone was dead, or perhaps, it was merely echoing something else. The thought sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the estate's perpetual chill. A peculiar pull, insistent and undeniable, drew me back to the study table, to the map. It lay spread out, a silent, demanding parchment. My earlier frustration at its incompleteness now seemed trivial, replaced by a morbid fascination. There was a section I had overlooked, a minute detail near the estate's northern boundary, rendered in a faded sepia ink that almost blended with the paper's age-worn hue. It wasn't a feature I recognized from any survey, nor did it match the known topography. It was a glyph, intricate and unsettling, unlike any cartographic symbol I had ever encountered, a knot of lines that seemed to writhe even as I stared. As my gaze sharpened on the glyph, the air around me thickened, growing viscous and heavy. The flickering lamplight in the study seemed to dim, then waver, as if struggling against an unseen current. The walls of the room began to stretch, the familiar bookshelves elongating into impossible perspectives. The room dissolved. I was standing in a long, deserted corridor. The light filtering through tall, arched windows was the pale, indifferent brilliance of a summer afternoon, yet the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Faded paint peeled from the lockers lining one side, their doors slightly ajar, revealing nothing but shadow. These were angular, distorted figures, with too many limbs and gaping, vacant eyes. Some depicted vast, subterranean chambers, others, spiraling tunnels that seemed to plunge into an infinite black. Interspersed among them were faded, hand-drawn maps of what appeared to be my own estate, but with additional, terrifying features, deep fissures, pulsating nodes, and a central, cyclopean eye drawn at the heart of the property, surrounded by radiating lines of containment. My breath caught in my throat. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, reeled. This was not real, yet it felt more real than the solid ground beneath my feet. I staggered forward, my hand brushing against the cool, grimy surface of a locker. One drawing, larger than the rest, dominated a section of the wall. It was a stark rendering of a vast, sealed chamber deep beneath the earth, crisscrossed with chains and ancient symbols, like a diagram of a cosmic lockbox. And beneath it, scrawled in a frantic hand that looked eerily like my own, were words I had somehow always known, words that now screamed their truth in my mind: it sleeps. It hungers. The map is not a guide to treasure, but a blueprint of a prison. A seal forged by those who came before, to contain what stirs below. And the seal weakens. My blood, our blood, is the key. To mend, or to break. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The map, my ancestral legacy, was not a quest for discovery, but a desperate plea, a warning. My meticulous work, my obsession with its completion, was not a hobby, but a predetermined path. I had not chosen the estate, it had chosen me. My lineage, a thread stretching back through generations, had drawn me here, a moth to a flame, either to reinforce the ancient bonds that held the buried horror at bay, or, God help me, to inadvertently shatter them, unleashing something unspeakable onto the world. The wrong decorations on the hallway walls now seemed to writhe, the grotesque figures mocking my ignorance, celebrating my arrival. I was not merely an heir, I was a pawn, a final piece in a game that had been playing out for centuries. The chalk dust scent grew overpowering, burning in my nostrils. The distorted drawings blurred, their edges softening, then dissolving into patches of peeling paint. The lockers shimmered, their metallic surfaces rippling like disturbed water. The pale summer light intensified, became blinding, then receded. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I was back in the study, slumped over the mahogany table, my face pressed against the cool, aged parchment of the map. But the glyph, that minute detail near the northern boundary, now pulsed with a faint, internal light, visible only to me. It no longer seemed an incomplete drawing, but a gaping wound, a breach in the earth, and in my own soul. I was not just mapping a property, I was mapping my own doom, and perhaps the doom of everything. The ancient force was not a distant threat. It was here, now, awake, and it knew my name. The air in the estate had begun to thicken, not with dust, but with a palpable pressure that bore down on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The revelation from the previous night, that my ancestors had left a warning, not a treasure map, festered within me, a cold ember of dread. Yet, a fierce determination had taken root beside the terror. I would not be a pawn. I would unravel this knot of legacy and malevolence. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, or the gentle abrasion of bone on bone, just beyond the threshold of hearing, but undeniably there. My fingers, usually so precise, trembled as I sifted through forgotten journals and ledgers, seeking an answer, a forgotten word, anything that might explain the map's true purpose. The afternoon bled into evening, painting the library's tall windows with the muted crimson of a dying sun. Frustration gnawed at me, sharpening the edges of my fear. I needed a direct sign, something unambiguous. As if an answer to my unspoken demand, a subtle vibration began to hum through the floorboards, a low thrum that resonated deep in my teeth. The vibration intensified, drawing me to a heavy oak door, one I'd always assumed led to a forgotten storage closet. The heavy oak door seemed to melt, its grain rippling like water. When I pushed it open, it was not into a storage closet. Faded posters of smiling children and rudimentary alphabet charts adorned the locker-lined walls, but they were interspersed with disturbing incongruities, drawings of skeletal figures dancing in a circle, a calendar marked with strange, angular symbols instead of dates, and garlands of withered, black plastic holly draped over every doorway. The air here was still and stale, smelling faintly of chalk dust and something else, something metallic and ancient, like wet earth. "You seek the truth, Cartographer." My breath hitched. The voice was not external, but seemed to bloom within my own skull, a frigid tendril unfurling behind my eyes. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white, fighting the urge to flee. This was it. The direct confrontation. Your family. A legacy of binding and neglect. The words were laced with a profound, simmering resentment, each syllable a tiny needle pricking at my consciousness. They left me hungry. They left you. I could feel an immense, unseen presence coalesce at the far end of the hallway, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. It felt vast, ancient, and utterly, terribly alive. The map. A key. A path to freedom. Mine. Your blood. The final seal. Or the final opening. The possessive hunger in its voice was undeniable, a raw, primeval need that resonated with a terrible truth. It wasn't just demanding something, it was demanding me. My very essence. My will. It sought to overwrite me, to become me, to finally break free. This was not a haunting. This was an imprisonment, a hunger. And my family, my ancestors, had been its jailers, and now, unwittingly, I had become the one releasing it. As the entity's presence swelled, threatening to overwhelm me, a flicker of light caught my eye. It wasn't from the sickly fluorescence, but from a small, almost invisible crack in the plaster of the hallway wall, directly across from where I stood. Within the crack, something was wedged. With trembling fingers, I pried at the loose plaster, revealing a rolled parchment, brittle with age. I unrolled it carefully. It was not a map, but a series of intricate, flowing symbols and glyphs, accompanied by faded, spidery script in a language I dimly recognized from my cartographic studies as an archaic dialect of the regional tongue. My eyes scanned the text, my mind racing to translate the obscure phrases. It spoke of the earth's slumber, the blood of the line, and the binding of the spirit. Then, a specific passage leaped out, stark and terrible. To reseal the maw, one must offer a sacrifice of self, not of flesh, but of the will that defines them. The cartographer's truth, the unwavering eye, the meticulous hand. It wasn't my life it wanted, not directly. It wanted me. It wanted the very core of my identity, the meticulous precision, the analytical mind, the unwavering focus that made me Reid, the cartographer. It wanted me to unravel myself, to become nothing, a blank slate, a vessel, to reseal it. If I failed, if I could not perform this impossible, soul-shattering act of will, this profound personal sacrifice, the entity would not merely be free, it would consume, distort, and twist everything it touched. My hands, still clutching the ancient parchment, began to shake uncontrollably. The choice was stark, agonizing. Surrender myself, or unleash an ancient horror upon the world. The entity's presence pulsed, a hungry, silent question in the air. I had found the countermeasure, yes, but it demanded a price that felt heavier than death itself. My resolve, once a flickering ember, now burned with the fierce, cold clarity of a forge fire. It wanted me, yes, but not as a vessel for its grotesque appetite. It craved the precise architecture of my mind, the very framework that ordered chaos into lines on a page. To give in, to surrender that core, would be to unravel into a formless horror, a cartographer without a compass in an infinite void. No. I would perform the ritual. I would sever the connection, even if it meant sacrificing a part of myself, a piece of the meticulous Reid that had always been. The thought tasted of ash and iron, but it was the only path left. I stood before the forgotten archway, revealed by the map's final, cryptic glyph. It was not a grand entrance, but a jagged tear in the estate's bedrock, cloaked by centuries of overgrowth and forgotten stone. My hand, steady despite the tremor in my chest, traced the rough-hewn stone. This was it. The deepest, most corrupted part of the estate. The descent was immediate and absolute. I counted each step, a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching disorder. 100. 200. Then, the world shifted. The metallic scent vanished, replaced by the faint, cloying sweetness of dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on lockers painted a cheerful, impossible blue. Posters of grinning, toothless children adorned the walls, their eyes following me with an unnerving intensity. A blackboard at the end of the hall displayed a complex geometric equation, not in chalk, but in something that glistened wetly, like fresh ink or, perhaps, something more visceral. The entity's assault. It was trying to dismantle my perception, to unravel the map of my reality. My cartographer's mind screamed at the incongruity, the impossible angles of the lockers, the way the floorboards stretched into infinity, refusing to meet a vanishing point. I knew this was not real, yet my senses screamed otherwise. This path leads only to the unmaking. You are not meant for this place. I pressed on, my boots echoing unnaturally loudly on the polished linoleum. It showed me maps I had drawn, meticulously crafted, now dissolving into swirling chaos, ink bleeding into nothingness. The hallway began to distort. The posters of children's faces stretched, their smiles widening into rictus grins, their eyes black, bottomless pits. A faint, high-pitched scratching sound echoed from behind the locker doors, as if something with too many claws was trying to get out. It was a physical barrier, not merely an illusion. The entity was growing bolder, its power manifesting in tangible forms. I ran my hand over the rough surface, it pulsed faintly, warm and slick beneath my fingers. You cannot pass, Cartographer. But I would not break. I reached for my mapping tools, not to draw, but to grip the solid, familiar weight of my compass, its brass cool against my palm. The entity wanted my precision? Then I would use it against it. I would find the flaw in its illusion, the weakness in its construct. I reopened my eyes. I focused on the stone barrier. It was not solid rock, but a mimicry. With a grunt, I plunged my crowbar into the crack, leveraging my weight. The stone shrieked, a sound that was not stone, but something like tearing flesh. The hallway writhed, the lights flickering wildly, the lockers slamming open and shut with percussive force. But I pulled again, harder, and with a sickening crunch, a section of the false rock gave way, revealing the true, ancient passage beyond. I scrambled through the gap, ignoring the grasping, illusory hands that tried to pull me back, ignoring the desperate pleas to turn away. The entity had shown me its hand, and I had pushed through. The ritual awaited. The deepest chamber of the estate beckoned, and I, Reid, Cartographer, would face it. The world dissolved around me, not with a roar, but with a sickening whisper that peeled away the very fabric of my perception. The intricate lines of my maps, the careful cross-hatching, the precise legends, all bled into a swirling, formless void, a chaotic slurry of ink and fear. My own voice, attempting to articulate a name, became another thread in the cacophony, lost. The hallway stretched before me, seemingly endless, lined with lockers painted in faded primary colors. But the decorations. Oh, the decorations. These were not the cheerful, vibrant displays of a thriving school. Taped haphazardly to the walls were crude, childlike drawings, rendered in crayon and felt tip. They depicted the ancestral estate, but horribly distorted. The manor house leaned precariously, its windows like gaping, empty eyes. The ancient oaks in the drawings writhed with impossible branches, some ending in clawed hands. And everywhere, scrawled in a frantic, illegible hand, were symbols I recognized from the margins of my ancestors' incomplete map, jagged lines, broken circles, a recurring motif of an eye torn open. This was no mere hallucination. This was the entity's playground, a twisted cartography of its dominion. It had pulled me into a manifestation of its corrupted influence, a physical representation of the chaos it sought to impose. They pressed in, a physical weight on my chest, threatening to buckle my knees. You cannot map what is formless, a voice slithered, distinct from the chorus, yet part of it, resonating from the very marrow of the bones in my skull. You cannot contain what has no boundary. But I could. My hands, trembling but resolute, found the rolled parchment I still clutched, my completed version of the ancestral map, the one with the final, crucial lines I had drawn. Now, I would show it order. The crude drawings were not random. They were a negative map, a mirror image of the entity's true form, its points of influence marked by the distorted trees, the gaping windows, and the recurring torn eye symbol. It was a glyph of vulnerability, a place where its influence was strongest, yet most exposed. But the very act of drawing, of defining boundaries, was anathema to it. It needed the land to be undefined, unmapped, so it could sprawl unchecked. The crude drawings on the hallway walls, meant to terrify, were in fact a chaotic, inverse key. The wrong decorations highlighted the precise points where the entity drew its strength, and by extension, where it could be contained. The central, most distorted drawing of the manor house, with the torn eye at its heart, was the nexus. From my satchel, I pulled out my compass, its brass gleaming even in the dim light, and a small, carefully stoppered vial of ink, specially prepared, infused with the dust of the ancestral land. This wasn't just ink, it was a boundary, a definition, a statement of intent. The entity shrieked, a sound that scraped against my teeth, as I unrolled my map. Madness. You draw on air. But I drew on the land, on the truth of its contours. I found the corresponding point on my map to the central, torn-eye drawing in the hallway. My fingers, guided by instinct honed by years of meticulous work, traced a circle around it, a perfect, unwavering line. Then, with the compass needle, I carefully pricked the very center of that circle. The hallway convulsed. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very space was collapsing inward. The entity's voice roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and agony. It was being defined, constrained, mapped. I could feel it, a tearing sensation, not just in the air, but within myself. It was as if the precision I had always relied upon, the unwavering belief in clear lines and defined spaces, was being traded for this act of containment. The red light faded. The roaring subsided, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to sink back into the linoleum, into the very foundations of this warped reality. I lay there, gasping, my map clutched to my chest, the ink now dry. The entity was contained, banished from its sprawling influence, trapped within the precise, unyielding boundaries I had drawn. But the cost. The world around me felt subtly, irrevocably off-star. The victory was mine, but the clarity of my vision, the unwavering certainty of my cartographer's soul, had been sacrificed on the altar of containment. The last stroke, the final, desperate curve, had been drawn not on paper, but on the very bedrock of my being. A silence, profound and absolute, fell like a shroud. It was not the silence of peace, but of a vacuum, an absence so vast it hummed with its own terrible weight. I lay amidst the debris, tasting dust and something metallic, something like old blood in churned earth. It was as if the very breath had been sucked from the world, leaving only a faint, bitter echo. My body, a collection of screaming nerves and aching bone, refused to obey. Each muscle fiber seemed to have been stretched to its breaking point, then snapped, leaving me an unstrung puppet. My vision, blurred and swimming, fought to make sense of the ruined chamber. Where intricate patterns had once adorned the walls, now great gashes scarred the stone, as if a giant, clawed hand had raked its fury across the surface. The entity was gone. I pushed myself up, a groan tearing from my throat, a sound I barely recognized as my own. My left arm hung useless, a dead weight. And when I looked down, I saw the ragged tear in my sleeve, the raw, angry wound beneath. As I staggered through the wreckage, my senses rebelled. The familiar contours of the estate's hidden depths warped before my eyes. The cracked stone walls, the fallen beams, the scattered relics of my frantic work, they all began to twist, to reconfigure themselves into something utterly alien and unsettling. The air, despite its thinness, grew heavy with the faint, sweet sick scent of stale chalk and forgotten dust. Before me, the cavernous space solidified into a long, narrow corridor. The ceiling, once a rough-hewn arch, became flat, tiled, stained with irregular, faded patches. The stone floor transformed into linoleum, scuffed and dull, crisscrossed with ghost-like trails of dirt. This was not the estate. The lockers, a row of rust-pitted metal boxes, stood silently on one side, their vents like gaping mouths. On the opposite wall, faded posters hung crookedly, not bright, cheerful advertisements for school plays or sporting events, but sepia-toned photographs of contorted, limb-like structures, and meticulous, hand-drawn diagrams of complex, branching root systems. They pulsed with a faint, internal light, shifting and blurring at the edges of my vision. It was all wrong. Utterly, terribly wrong. Was this the entity's final gift? A fractured reality, a vision imposed upon my exhausted perception? Or something worse, a piece of it, lodged within me, twisting the very fabric of my world? The entity was gone, yes, but not entirely. It had been driven back, perhaps, or dispersed, but a residue remained. A whisper in the deep currents of my consciousness. I felt it, not as a voice, but as a subtle shift in perspective, a new, terrible understanding of the interconnectedness of things, of the ancient roots that ran beneath the surface of the mundane world. My fingers, still stained with earth and what I now knew was something far older than mere soil, twitched with an involuntary impulse. I wanted to draw, to chart this new, distorted landscape, to give form to the chaos that had been unleashed, and perhaps, to the chaos that now resided within me. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. They would not see the scars on the land, or the deeper, more indelible ones etched into my soul. The estate, my ancestral home, was a ruin, a monument to a battle fought unseen, a victory that felt more like a damnation. The silence stretched, vast and indifferent, and I, Reid, cartographer of the lost, was now a cartographer of the broken, forever mapping the contours of a horror that had become a part of me. The tension was no longer about what was coming, but what had already arrived and taken root. A silence, profound and absolute, fell like a shroud. My ears rang, a high, thin whine that seemed to emanate not from within, but from the very air around me, a sound the world itself made in the wake of such a violation. The cellar, or what remained of the excavation, felt vast and empty, the unseen presence either banished or simply satiated. Days blurred. I moved through the estate like a ghost haunting its own ruins, gathering what few belongings I could tolerate touching. The maps, the old journals, the instruments, all were packed with a meticulousness born of a desperate need for order, a futile attempt to impose structure on the chaos that had become my internal landscape. The drive away from the estate was a slow crawl through a world suddenly too bright, too loud, too utterly indifferent. Each tree, each patch of sky, felt like a mockery of the profound shift that had occurred within me. I was no longer merely Reid, the cartographer, I was Reid, the keeper of a terrible, unspeakable truth. My initial thought was to simply disappear, to find some quiet corner of the world where I could forget. My old life, my old apartment, my cherished routines, all felt like ill-fitting garments. It led me, incongruously, to a building I vaguely remembered as a community center, now repurposed for various public services during the summer. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the linoleum floor. It was the decorations. Tattered paper snowflakes, faded from last winter, hung alongside crude, hand-drawn pumpkins from some forgotten autumn event. A string of fairy lights, clearly for a holiday party, was draped over a bulletin board adorned with crudely cut-out leprechauns. The incongruity was jarring, a visual cacophony that mirrored the jumbled, fractured state of my own mind. Each mismatched ornament seemed to pulse with a low, insidious energy, a quiet testament to the world's subtle unraveling. I felt a prickle on my skin, as if the very air in that hallway was composed of tiny, vibrating fragments of time out of joint. My breath caught, a dry rasp in my throat. It was a resonance, an echo of the deeper discord now rooted within me. I tried to resume my work. The meticulous lines, the precise measurements, the careful hatching of contours, these were my solace, my anchors. But the maps I drew now felt different. My hand, once guided by objective observation, seemed to possess a new, almost involuntary intuition. My colleagues, when I occasionally met with them, spoke of mundane projects, of boundary disputes and historical markers. I would nod, feigning interest, all the while seeing not the neat lines of their charts, but the vast, intricate web of connections, the pulsing arteries of an ancient, malevolent will that I now knew permeated the very bedrock of existence. The entity was contained, yes, but it was not gone. I had not vanquished it, I had merely satisfied it. And in doing so, I had forged a bond, a silent, terrible pact. The price I paid was not my life, not my immediate sanity, but a deeper, more insidious currency. I carried the knowledge of it, a constant, low thrum beneath my skin. Sometimes, when the world grew quiet, I could almost hear the slow, deliberate pulse of the earth, a rhythm that was no longer merely geological, but something far more ancient and alive. I would stare at them for hours, a strange compulsion driving my gaze, searching for patterns, for the faint, almost invisible scars on the landscape that hinted at what lay beneath. I had survived, yes, but I was no longer entirely my own. I was its unwitting guardian, its silent witness. The horror was contained, but it lived within me, a quiet, persistent whisper in the darkest corners of my mind, reminding me that the world was not as solid, not as safe, as I once believed. A strange, quiet sense of duty, a deep-seated understanding that the mapping was never truly finished. That I was the only one left to continue the work.